He already got down on one knee, and it wasn't for me. Maggie Holloway heard those words through the kitchen wall and stopped breathing. Her hands went still in the dishwater. In the parlor, her brother Roy was telling Clara about the widow Pruitt's youngest daughter, 19 years old, pretty as a spring morning, and how Nate Whitaker had supposedly been seen riding past her father's fence 3 times last week. "Man like that's got to settle down sometime," Roy said. "Got to pick someone." Clara laughed softly. Neither of them lowered their voices. Neither of them thought to. Why would they? Maggie was just in the kitchen. She always was. If this story hit something inside you, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop a comment and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next is going to rearrange everything you think you know about Loveworth and the women this world forgot to look at twice. Maggie pulled her hands out of the dishwater and dried them on her apron without making a sound. That was something she had learned a long time ago. How to receive a blow without flinching where anyone could see. How to keep her face arranged and her hands busy and her voice when she needed to use it steady. It was not a skill she had set out to learn. It was the kind of thing that gets built into a woman slowly, the way calluses form layer by layer from the same friction applied in the same place over enough years. She picked up the pot she'd been scrubbing and set it on the drying rack. Through the wall, Roy was still talking. "Man needs a young woman, someone who can give him more children. He's got 2 grown ones already, he'll want a fresh start." "I suppose," Clara said. "Whitaker's smart. He won't waste time." Maggie untied her apron, folded it over the counter, and walked out the back door. She stood in the yard in the July heat and breathed through her nose until her chest stopped doing what it was doing. The sun was already brutal at 8:30 in the morning, the kind of sun that made the dirt look white and the air taste like metal. She stood in it and let it press down on her and told herself what she always told herself. It doesn't matter. It never mattered. You knew that. She had known that. She had known it for years. She was 40 years old and large and plain, and the kind of woman people described by listing what she did rather than who she was. The one who keeps Roy's house. The one who brought soup to the Hendersons. The one who sat with old Jeremiah Reeves when he was dying. She was useful. She was reliable. She was, in the language of this territory, a good woman. Good women in Maggie's experience died alone in narrow rooms and got called saints at their funerals. She was not bitter about it. That was the truth, not performance. Bitterness required a kind of ongoing energy she had long since redirected toward things that actually needed doing. What she carried instead was something quieter and heavier, a settled understanding of her own position in the world. The way you understand the layout of a house you've lived in so long, you can walk it in the dark. She knew where every wall was. She had stopped expecting doors. Earl Beckwith found her there when he came around from the barn, a bucket in each hand, his white beard catching the morning light. He was the oldest of Roy's remaining ranch hands, 60-something, rope-scarred, unhurried, and he had known Maggie since she was 12 years old. He set the buckets down without a word and stood beside her. "You eaten anything this morning?" he said finally. "I cooked for 6 people. I'll eat when they're done." "That ain't what I asked." She looked at him sideways. "No." He made a sound that was not quite a word and picked his buckets back up. "Heard Whitaker's coming by today." "I know." "Roy nervous?" "Roy's always nervous when money's involved, and he's the one who owes it." Earl snorted. "Man borrowed against good land. Can't say that wasn't a gamble." "I told him it was a gamble." She said it flatly without satisfaction. "He thanked me for my concern and did it anyway." "Men do that." "They do." Earl moved off toward the trough. Over his shoulder he said, "His foreman Davies rode past the south fence yesterday. Whitaker don't send Davies ahead unless he's already made up his mind about something." Maggie filed that away and went back inside to start the midday beans. Roy came through the kitchen at 8:45 with his good shirt on, which told her everything about how seriously he was taking this. He poured himself coffee, drank half of it standing up, set the cup down without finishing it. "What do you know about Whitaker?" he said. She kept stirring. What do you want to know? Is he a fair man, or is he the kind that squeezes? He's the kind that doesn't need to squeeze because he's already in a stronger position before he walks in the door. She paused. But no, he's not cruel. He's not dishonest. If he makes you an offer, it'll be real. Whether it's good enough is a different question. Roy drummed his fingers on the counter. The northern pasture is the only thing he wants, Maggie said. And you know that, so does he. So the only question is what he's willing to pay for something he already knows you can't afford to keep. Roy looked at her with the expression he'd been giving her his whole life, half irritated, half grudgingly. Grateful, the look of a man who keeps finding out his sister was right and doesn't quite know what to do about it. You could sit in, he said, on the meeting. She turned from the stove. That surprised her enough that she let it show. You want me there? I want... He stopped. Started again. You see things, you always have. He picked up his coffee cup, remembered it was half empty, set it down again. Just stay in the room. You don't have to say anything. All right, she said. She stayed in the room. She stood at the counter with a dish towel in her hands that she didn't need, and she listened. Nathaniel Whitaker arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. He came to the front door, not the back, and he knocked instead of calling out from the yard. Davies, his foreman, waited outside with the horses. Whitaker came in alone. I was not what she expected. She did not know precisely what she had expected. A larger man, maybe louder, with the particular performance of authority that wealthy men in this territory sometimes put on like a coat. What she got instead was someone quieter than that. 46 years old, built solid from a lifetime of actual work, with a face that had been weathered into something more interesting than handsome. Dark gray eyes. A way of entering a room that didn't announce itself. He looked at Maggie first. Not Roy. Not the room. Her. Morning, he said. I'm Nate Whitaker. Margaret Holloway, she said. Roy's sister. He's expecting you. Yes, ma'am. He held her gaze for a half-second longer than was strictly required, then turned to Roy with his hand extended. Roy shook it and launched into the version of himself he used for important men. Confident, unhurried, a man in full possession of his own affairs. Maggie watched Whitaker listen to it without any visible reaction, which told her he heard exactly what it was. Appreciate you coming out, Mr. Whitaker, Roy said. Can I offer you coffee? Already had mine, thank you. Well then, the northern pasture. Roy spread the deed map on the table like a man laying down cards he was proud of. Good land, well watered. I've been thinking about what direction to take it and... Mr. Holloway, Whitaker said not unkindly. You borrowed against it 14 months ago and haven't touched the principal. I'm not here to make you feel bad about that. I'm here because that land borders my water route and I need access easement. I'd like to make you a fair offer for the easement rights plus grazing arrangement that benefits both operations. He paused. What I won't do is pretend we're talking about something other than what we're talking about. The room went quiet. Roy's confident performance deflated by about a third. To his credit, he recovered quickly. What kind of offer? Whitaker named a number. Maggie kept her face still. The number was better than fair. It was generous. And the grazing arrangement he outlined in the following 5 minutes was structured in a way that would actually stabilize Roy's operation for the next several years, if Roy managed it properly, which was not guaranteed, but was at least possible. She watched her brother try to negotiate up from the number Whitaker had offered, and watched Whitaker listen to him. Do it with the patience of a man who had already decided what he was willing to pay, and was simply allowing Roy the dignity of the attempt. I can go to 800 over what I offered, Whitaker said finally. That's where I stop. Roy looked at Maggie. It was quick, just a glance, but Whitaker caught it. His eyes moved to her face. She gave Roy the smallest nod. We have a deal, Roy said. Whitaker extended his hand again. While Roy was shaking it, Maggie turned back to the counter and began moving things that did not need to be moved. She heard the rustle of papers, the scratch of a pen, the low voices of the 2 men settling the details. Then Whitaker said, Miss Holloway. She turned. Thank you for your hospitality. I didn't do much, she said. You were here, he said. That counts for something. He said it simply without weight or intention that she could name. Then he put his hat on, said good day to Roy, and walked out. Maggie stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed. That counts for something. She told herself it was nothing. Good manners. The kind of thing a well-raised man said without thinking. She told herself that for 3 days. On the 4th day, Roy came in from the barn, with a look on his face she hadn't seen in a while, sheepish, circling the edges of something he didn't know how to say. What? She said. Whitaker asked about you. She did not move. When? After we signed. I walked him out to his horse and he asked casual like it was nothing. He said, your sister. She been keeping house here long. Roy picked up an apple from the bowl on the table and turned it in his hands without biting it. I said most of her life. He asked if she was married. I said no. Roy looked at her sideways. He didn't say much after that, just nodded and rode out. Maggie turned back to the stove. That's not anything, Roy. Maybe not. Men ask things. It doesn't mean anything. Sure, Roy said. He left the apple on the table and went back out. Maggie stared at the pot in front of her without seeing it for a full minute before she remembered what she was supposed to be cooking. She did not sleep well that night. She had not lost sleep over a man in 13 years. The last time it had ended with her standing on a church steps in a dress she'd saved 4 months to have made, watching a man she had believed in explain to her in a lowered voice that he had changed his mind, that he was sorry, that he hoped she understood. She had told him she understood. She had walked home alone. She had hung the dress in the back of the wardrobe where she did not have to look at it, and she had made herself a promise. No more. You know better. Some things are not for you, and pretending otherwise only makes the landing harder. She had kept that promise for 13 years. She had built a life around the absence of that particular kind of hoping, and it was a real life full in its own way, useful, not without meaning. She had decided that meaning came from what you did, not from who chose you, and mostly she believed it. She stared at the ceiling of her narrow room and told herself she still believed it. She almost managed it. On the 5th morning, she opened the back door to throw out the wash water and found Nate Whitaker standing in the yard. Not Davies. Not a message sent through Roy. Nate Whitaker himself alone had in his hand. Her first thought was that something had gone wrong with the paperwork. Her second thought was that she was still in her work apron and her hair wasn't properly pinned. Her third thought was that she was furious at herself for having a second thought. Mr. Whitaker. She kept her voice level. Roy's in the field. I know. He didn't move toward the house. He stood in the yard in the morning heat, turning his hat by the brim, the way a nervous man does, and that detail stopped her, because nothing else about him read as nervous. I'm not here to see Roy. She set the wash basin down on the step. Then what can I do for you? He walked toward her. Slow. Deliberate. The walk of a man who has made a decision and has stopped second-guessing it. I've been trying to find the right way to start this conversation, he said. Couldn't find one, so I'm just going to say what I came to say. All right. I've known who you are for longer than you'd guess. He stopped 6 feet away. I've seen you at the Pruitt place, the Reeves homestead. 3 different times at Henderson's when their boy was sick, and once at the Calvert place at midnight when nobody else came. His gray eyes held on her face. I've watched you do things for this valley that men who sit on the town council take credit for, and I've never once heard you ask for anything back. Maggie said nothing. There was no safe thing to say. I'm 46 years old, he said. My wife passed 4 years ago. I've got a house that's too big and too quiet, and 2 grown children who don't know what a warm home feels like because I didn't know how to make one after she was gone. He paused. I've got more land than one man needs, and more money than I can spend, and none of it means one thing at the end of a day when I go home to nothing. Mr. Whitaker, I'm not finished. She stopped. The world looks at you and sees a woman who keeps her brother's kitchen, he said. I look at you and see someone who has been holding this entire community together with both hands while everyone else looked somewhere else. He took 1 step forward. I don't need a housekeeper. I've got one. I don't need someone to raise children. Mine are raised. I need someone with the kind of strength and sense and real human decency that I've spent 4 years looking for and haven't found anywhere else." His voice did not rise. It did not perform. It simply said what it said. "So I'm going to ask you something, and I'm going to ask you straight." The yard was completely still. "Will you marry me, Miss Holloway?" The wash basin was still on the step. The pot she'd meant to bring in was still on the hook by the door. The July sun was still pressing down on everything like a flat, hot hand. None of it moved. Maggie stood inside the stillness of it and felt something she had not felt in 13 years crack open in her chest, like ground that's been frozen too long finally giving way. "I beg your pardon," she said. "You heard me. You don't know me. I know more than you think. You've seen me around town, at other people's sickbeds. I've watched you for 4 years." He said it without apology, without drama. "I know the difference between watching a person and knowing them, but I also know what I see when I look close enough to be sure." He took another step. "I see a woman who's given everything she has and gotten very little back. And I see a woman who deserves to be asked this question by a man who means every word of it." Her eyes were burning. She was angry at them for that. "I'm 40 years old," she said. "I know how old you are." "I'm not—" She stopped. The sentence she'd been about to say, "I'm not what men want," died before she could finish it, because the man who was standing in front of her had just asked her to marry him, and she did not know what to do with that information. "You could have anyone," she said instead. "I don't want anyone." He held her gaze. "I want your answer." She pressed her palms flat against her apron. Breathed once. Let the air out slow. "I can't give you an answer here," she said. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She made herself look directly at him. Made herself say the whole thing. "I've been a woman that people overlook my entire life. I've had kindness offered to me in private that disappeared the minute someone else was watching. I've been told things in quiet rooms that turned out to mean nothing in the daylight." Her voice stayed even. She had practice at that. "If you mean what you just said to me, then you can say it again where it means something. Not in a backyard. Not alone. Where people can hear you. Where it cannot be taken back." I was very still. "You want me to ask you again," he said slowly. "In town. In front of whoever's there. In front of all of them." She held his gaze without flinching. "If you mean it, that should not be a difficult thing to do." Something moved across his face. Not offense. Not hesitation. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like the expression of a man who has just been shown something he wasn't expecting and has decided he respects it. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning." "All right." He put his hat on. Looked at her one more time. "Miss Holloway." "Mr. Whitaker." "Get some rest." A pause. "Tomorrow's going to matter." He turned, walked to his horse mounted clean and easy, and rode out of the yard without looking back. Maggie did not move for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. She understood the difference between fear and this. This was what happened when something you had sealed off years ago got forced back open before you were ready, and the air that rushed in was neither good nor bad, but simply overwhelming. Earl appeared around the side of the barn. "Miss Maggie." He looked at her. "You all right?" She turned around. She had her face in order by the time she faced him. It was not even difficult. That was the thing about calloused places, they didn't hurt the same way soft ones did. "Beans need checking," she said. "Come eat when you're ready." She walked back inside. She did not tell Roy. She did not tell Clara. She put the beans on and mended 2 shirts and checked the bread she had rising in the cloth by the window. And when the supper dishes were done, she went to her narrow room with the slanted ceiling and lay down on top of the quilt without taking her boots off. She stared at the dark above her. He was either going to come or he wasn't. If he didn't come, she would know. She would know before she had allowed herself to believe too much, and she would fold it away the way she had folded other things, and she would go on. She was good at going on. It was the one skill she had never had to work at. If he came, she pressed both hands flat against her chest. felt her own heartbeat there faster than usual, stubborn and inconvenient and alive. If he came tomorrow and stood in front of the whole town and said those words again, then everything she had decided about herself, every conclusion she had drawn from 40 years of being the woman in the background. The woman. Nobody picked the woman who served and sacrificed and stayed invisible. All of it would have to be looked at again. She was not sure she knew how to do that. She was also not sure she was going to be given a choice. Maggie Holloway lay in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses, the wind, the distant call of something wild and far away, and she held her own shaking hands together over her heart. And she waited for morning like a woman standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. She had jumped off edges before. She had always survived them. This one felt different. This one felt like it might not ask her to survive. This one felt like it might ask her to live. Maggie did not sleep. She lay on top of the quilt until the first gray light came through the crooked window frame, and then she got up, washed her face in the basin, pinned her hair the way she always pinned it, and went to the kitchen to start the fire. Her hands worked on their own the way they always did. The kindling, the match, the pot, the water, while the rest of her was somewhere else entirely turning over the same question she had been turning over since Nate Whitaker rode out of the yard the afternoon before. What if he doesn't come? She knew the answer. She had already rehearsed it. She would come home, she would start the midday meal. She would tell herself she had expected nothing, and therefore lost nothing, and she would believe it well enough to function. She was good at that. She had been good at that for a long time. What she had not rehearsed was the other possibility. Earl came in at 6:30 and sat at the small table by the door. He looked at her he sometimes did not staring, just watching the way an old man watches someone. He's known a long time and has learned to read without asking. "You eating this morning?" he said. "I'm fine." "That ain't what I asked." She put a biscuit on a plate and set it in front of him without looking up. He ate half of it, then set it down. "Whitaker's a straight man," Earl said, not to her directly, more to the room in general. "In case that means anything to anybody." Maggie poured her coffee and said nothing. "Known him by reputation since before he bought the second parcel up north. Man does what he says. Don't make promises he ain't going to keep." Earl picked up the other half of the biscuit. "Just in case that means anything." "Eat your breakfast, Earl." "Yes, ma'am." Roy came down at 7, Clara behind him with Bobby on her hip. Roy looked at Maggie with the expression she'd been dreading. The one that meant he'd thought about things overnight and wanted to have a conversation she did not want to have. "You going to town this morning?" he said. "I had some things to see to." "What things?" She looked at him. "Things, Roy." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Clara, who gave him the particular expression that wives give husbands when the husbands are about to say something they should not say. Roy closed his mouth again. "Take the bay mare," he said finally. "She's easier on the road." Maggie looked at her brother for a moment. Sometimes he surprised her. Not often, but sometimes. "Thank you," she said. She left the house at 8:15. The road into town was 3 miles of hard-packed dirt that ran straight and flat under a sky that had not decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. The bay mare moved at an easy pace, and Maggie let her because she was in no hurry to arrive and in no condition to pretend otherwise. Her stomach was doing something she did not have a name for, something between dread and wanting, and the specific kind of terror that comes not from fearing the worst, but from fearing the best, from fearing that something might actually be real, and then having to figure out what to do about it. She was 40 years old. She had stopped practicing hope the same way a body stops practicing a language it no longer needs. She had let those particular muscles go slack. And now they were being asked to work again, and they hurt the way unused muscles always hurt when you ask too much of them without warning. She tied the mare at the post outside the dry goods store and did not look around. She would not look around. If he was there, she would know without searching. If he wasn't, she didn't want to be seen searching. She went into the dry goods store and asked Harriet Bowl behind the counter for the 2 spools of thread she didn't actually need. Harriet was a pleasant, round-faced woman of 50 who knew everything that happened in this town, approximately 4 hours before it happened, and was generous with the information. "Morning, Maggie. You hear about the Pruitt girl?" "I haven't." "Engaged to the Daily Boy from Billings. Can you imagine, she's barely 17. Harriet shook her head with the particular satisfaction of someone who finds all news, good or bad, equally entertaining. "Course that's how it goes, young and pretty, and they don't wait 5 minutes. She set the thread spools on the counter and named the price. Then she leaned forward slightly. "You see the commotion outside." Maggie's hands stilled on the coins she was counting. "What commotion?" "Nate Whitaker rode into town about 20 minutes ago and has been standing in front of the land office ever since. Just standing there. Davy's with him and 2 of his other men. People are starting to wonder." Harriet tilted her head. "You know anything about that?" "No," Maggie said. The word came out steady. She was proud of that. She took her thread and walked out. He was there. Howe was standing exactly where Harriet said, in front of the land office, 30 feet down the main street, hat in hand, with Davies beside him, and 2 ranch hands she didn't know flanking them both. But it was the other people that hit her first. Because in the 20 minutes since Nate Whitaker had arrived and taken up his position in the middle of the street, word had apparently moved through the town the way word always moved through small places, fast and indiscriminate, and there were already 15 people on the boardwalk and more coming. She could see Martha Calden from the milliner's shop standing in her doorway. She could see Reverend Price stopped mid-stride on his way somewhere. She could see the 3 women from yesterday, the ones who'd been talking under Roy's window, standing together in a cluster near the water trough, their faces arranged in expressions of careful attention. Whitaker saw her the moment she stepped off the porch. He didn't move toward her. He didn't call out. He just saw her, and the seeing was enough. It landed on her the way a hand on the shoulder lands, specific and certain. Maggie's feet started moving before she made a decision about it. Across the dry dirt of the main street. Past the water trough. Past the 3 women who had called her a draft horse, who were now very quiet. Past Reverend Price, who had stopped entirely and was watching with his hands folded in front of him. She stopped 6 feet from Whitaker. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "I know what you said." "Then you know I mean what I say." He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the yard, directly, without performance, with the full weight of his attention. "I've been standing here a while. Figured the longer I stood here, the more people would come, and the more people came, the more it would mean when I asked you." Behind her, she heard someone whisper something. She didn't turn around. "That was calculated," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I've been known to think ahead." She almost smiled. She stopped herself, but it was close. He took a step forward. Around them, the street had gone the particular kind of quiet that only happens when people sense they are watching something that will be talked about later. The whispers had stopped. Even the horses seemed to have stilled. Nate Whitaker reached up, adjusted his hat, then removed it entirely and held it at his side. I was not performing now. She could see that. Whatever he was doing, it had gone past performance. "Margaret Holloway," he said, and his voice carried because he was not trying to lower it. "I asked you this yesterday in a backyard where nobody could hear, and you told me that wasn't good enough. You were right." He paused. "So I'm asking you again, where everyone can hear, where it can't be hushed up or taken back or explained away." Another pause. "Will you marry me?" The silence was so complete, she could hear her own heartbeat. 40 years old. Too plain, too large, too much, not enough. Every word that had ever been applied to her seemed to rise up in that moment and hang in the air between her and this man who was asking her the question she had stopped waiting to be asked. She heard Martha Calden make a small sound. She heard one of the 3 women say something under her breath. She looked at Nate Whitaker's face. She looked at it the way you look at something when you are deciding whether to trust it, not at what it's showing you, but at what it's not hiding. She had gotten good at that distinction over the years. 13 years of very deliberate attention to the difference between a man's words and what lived underneath them. What she saw underneath Nate Whitaker's face was simply this: he meant it. "Yes," she said. "Nathaniel Whitaker. I will." The sound that went through the crowd was strange, not quite cheering, not quite gasping. Something between. The sound of 20 people recalibrating their understanding of something they thought they already knew. Whitaker put his hat back on. A slow exhale moved through him, like a man who has been holding himself very still and has finally been given permission to breathe. "Thank you," he said quietly, this part, just to her, not for the street. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You haven't seen me angry." That surprised a real laugh out of him. Low, genuine, the laugh of a man who has not found many things funny in a while. Davies behind him cleared his throat in a way that was clearly meant to disguise his own reaction. One of the other ranch hands was grinning at the ground. The three women by the water trough were not grinning. Maggie was aware of them, the way you're aware of a splinter, not debilitating, but present. Martha Doyle, who had done most of the talking under the window yesterday, was looking at her now with an expression that had shifted from careful attention to something sharper and less comfortable. Maggie met her eyes. She held them just long enough to make the point. Then she looked back at Whitaker. "I should go home," she said. "I have things to tell my brother." "I'll ride with you if that's acceptable." She considered this. "It's acceptable." They walked to the hitching post together, and the whole town watched them do it, and Maggie kept her back straight and her chin level, and did not look at anyone who was staring at her, because she did not need to. She knew what they were seeing. She had been underestimated by every one of them long enough to know the exact texture of their surprise, and she found that she did not need to address it. What she needed to do was get home before the feeling in her chest expanded to a size she couldn't manage in public. The ride back was 3 miles. They rode side by side, close but not touching, and for the first half-mile neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have both said the important thing and are letting it settle. Whitaker broke it first. "I should tell you some things," he said. "Before you talk to Roy. Before you make any final arrangements in your mind." "All right." "My children." He looked at the road ahead. "Emma is 22. She lives in Helena with her husband. She was close with her mother. She's going to have opinions about this." "I'd expect so." "My son Thomas is 19. He's at the ranch. He's a good young man, but He paused. "He's had a hard few years. The loss hit him different. He doesn't let people in easy." "That's understandable." "I'm telling you because I want you to know what you're walking into. I'm not telling you to give you a reason to change your answer." He glanced at her. "I want to be clear about that." "I didn't think you were." He nodded. "The house is large. My housekeeper is a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who has been with me 12 years, and who will be perfectly fine once she has time to adjust. My foreman Davies you've met. The crew is 18 men, which is a different thing than 6. A pause. "I'm telling you all of this because you don't strike me as a woman who likes surprises, and I'd rather lay things out plain." "I appreciate that, and I want to know things about you," he said. "I know what I've observed. I don't know what you'd tell me yourself, which is different and matters more." She looked at him. "What do you want to know?" "What do you want?" He said it simply. "Not what you can give or what you're used to providing. What do you actually want for yourself out of what's left of your life?" She was quiet for long enough that a less patient man would have rephrased the question or moved on. Whitaker rode beside her and waited. "I want to be useful in a way that's chosen," she said finally. "Not assigned. I've been useful my whole life and I don't object to that. But I want—" She paused. "I want it to be mine. My choice. What I offer and when and to whom." She stopped again because she hadn't said this out loud before, and it felt strange in her mouth, like a word in a language she'd only ever read. "I want to matter to someone specific, not as a category, not as the woman who keeps the house or the woman who helps the sick, to someone specific, as a specific person." Whitaker was quiet for a moment. "I can offer you that," he said. "I can offer you that genuinely, not as a promise to keep you satisfied, as the actual thing itself." She believed him. She did not know why she believed him so quickly, except that she had spent 40 years developing a precise understanding of the difference between what men said and what they meant. and this man said and meant appeared to be the same thing. That was rarer than it should have been. They reached the edge of Roy's land. Through the fence, she could see the house and the barn and Earl near the gate, doing something with a length of rope. "One more thing," Whitaker said. She waited. "I'm not asking you to become someone else," he said. "I'm not asking you to be smaller or quieter or more what people expect a rancher's wife to look like. I've got no interest in that." He met her eyes. "I saw what I saw. I want what I saw. Not a modified version of it." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. In 40 years, no one had ever said that to her. Not like that. Not without some invisible condition attached, some small print, some implication that what she was needed, some softening or rearrangement to be fully acceptable. Even the kindest people in her life had loved her in ways that carried some suggestion of, if only she were a little less this, a little more that. She felt something shift in her chest. Tectonic. Slow and huge. "I'll talk to Roy today," she said. "Take whatever time you need." "I don't need much time. I know my own mind." She paused. 13 years of practice. He looked at her at that a quick questioning glance. "I'll explain that another time," she said. She rode in through the gate. Earl saw them, and his whole face changed. He read the situation in about 3 seconds, the way old men with good instincts do, and he had the decency to look at the rope in his hands instead of at Maggie. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker," Earl said. "Morning." Whitaker tipped his hat, then looked at Maggie. "I'll wait here while you speak to Roy." She nodded and dismounted and went inside. Roy was at the kitchen table with Clara, a ledger open between them, and when Maggie walked in, they both looked up with the specific alertness of people who have been discussing something and have just been interrupted. She could tell from the quality of the silence that the subject had been her. "You went to town," Roy said. "I did." "Whitaker was in town this morning. Word came back with Jenkins." Roy closed the ledger slowly. "He asked you again, in front of everybody." "He did." The silence stretched. "And," Clara said, because Roy seemed to have temporarily misplaced his voice. "And I said yes." Clara made a sound involuntary small something between surprise and something warmer than that. Roy stood up. He did not look angry. He looked like a man working through a large number of feelings in a short amount of time and trying to do it with some dignity. "Nate Whitaker," he said. "Yes." "Maggie. The man owns half the territory." "I know what the man owns, Roy. That's not—" He ran a hand through his hair. "I just mean, are you sure about this? You barely know him. I know enough." She sat down at the table because she had been on her feet since before dawn, and her legs were entitled to a rest. "I know he's a straight man who says what he means. I know he's not cruel. I know he came to town this morning and stood in the street and asked me again in front of anyone who cared to watch, which is more than any man has done for me in 40 years. She looked at her brother. "Are you going to tell me I shouldn't do this?" Roy opened his mouth, closed it. "No," he said. "Good. I'm going to tell you." He stopped again. Something moved across his face, complicated and quiet. You should have had this. Years ago. Someone should have." He stopped a third time, and Maggie recognized the particular struggle of a man who has just realized something too late and doesn't know what to do with the understanding. "Roy," she said, not unkindly. "Don't. I know." She met his eyes. "I know." He sat back down. Clara reached over and put her hand on his arm without saying anything, which was the right thing to do, and Maggie appreciated her for it. "He's outside," Maggie said. "He wants to speak to you. The two of you should talk." "About what?" "About arrangements. About what this means for the land agreement, if anything. About whatever men talk about when one of them is going to marry the other's sister." She stood up again. "Be decent to him, Roy. He's a good man. When have I not been decent?" She looked at him. "That's fair," he said quietly. She went back outside. Whitaker was still where she'd left him, standing with his horse, talking in a low voice to Earl, who had apparently decided that the rope could wait. Earl looked up when she came out, and his expression was the closest thing to pleased she had seen on that old worn face in a long time. "Roy's ready to talk to you," she told Whitaker. "Thank you." He handed her the reins to his horse without thinking about it, the way you hand something to a person you trust, and walked toward the house. Maggie stood there holding the reins of a horse that wasn't hers, and watching a man she had agreed to marry walk into her brother's house, and she felt the full strangeness of the morning land on her all at once, not unpleasantly, but with the weight of something real. "You gonna be all right?" Earl said. "Ask me in a week. I'll ask you right now." She looked at the old man. His eyes were quiet and steady under the brim of his hat. The eyes of someone who has seen enough of the world to know the difference between things that end well and things that don't, and has decided to cast his vote here. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." He nodded once. That was enough. Inside, she could hear the low register of men talking Roy's voice, then Whitaker's, then Roy's again. Not arguing. Just talking the careful way men talk when they are working out the terms of something that matters. She had heard that register her whole life and been excluded from every conversation it meant. It did not escape her that this particular conversation was about her, which was different. She sat on the porch step and held the reins loosely and let the morning settle around her. She thought about Emma in Helena, who had opinions. She thought about Thomas at the ranch, who didn't let people in. She thought about a house she had never been in, 18 ranch hands instead of 6, a housekeeper named Mrs. Aldridge, who would need time to adjust. She thought about everything that would need to change, and everything she would have to learn, and everything that would be hard before it got easier. She thought about Martha Doyle's face when Whitaker had asked. She thought about the words she had said to him on the road. "I want to matter to someone specific. As a specific person." She had never said that out loud before. She had barely let herself think it. And he had not flinched. He had not given her the look she was used to, the well-meaning but slightly pained look of someone receiving more vulnerability than they knew how to hold. He had simply said, "I can offer you that," like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Like it was, in fact, the whole point. She heard the door behind her, and Whitaker came out. He stood beside her for a moment, before sitting down on the step to her right, the two of them shoulder to shoulder on the porch of the house where she had lived her whole life as the woman nobody thought to ask. "He's a good man," Whitaker said. "Your brother. He tries to be. He's worried about you. He shouldn't be. He should be a little. That's what brothers are for." A pause. "He told me about the man 13 years ago." She went very still. "Roy doesn't know all of it. He knows enough to be careful with you. I think he was testing me a little." A pause. "I passed, I think." "What did he ask you?" "He asked me what I saw in you." Whitaker looked at the yard. "I told him. It took a few minutes. He was quiet after. Then he shook my hand." She did not say anything for a moment. "What did you tell him?" He turned and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him. And this close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, and the way his jaw set, and the gray in his hair at the temples, and the thing in his face that she had been trying to name since the first morning he walked through Roy's door. It was steadiness. Not stillness, steadiness. The difference between a man who was calm because nothing touched him, and a man who had been touched by everything and had found a way to keep standing. The second kind was rarer and worth considerably more. "I told him," Whitaker said, "that I saw a woman the world had been wrong about for a long time, and that I intended to spend whatever years I had left being right about her instead." Maggie looked at him. She had held herself together through the sleepless night and the morning ride and the public proposal and the conversation with Roy and the sitting on the porch waiting. She had held everything in its proper place with the practiced architecture of a woman who has learned that falling apart is a luxury she rarely gets to afford. Something cracked small and clean in the back of her throat. She pressed her lips together and looked out at the yard. "You're going to have to stop saying things like that," she said. "Probably not," he said. She breathed out, long and slow. Her hands were steady in her lap. That surprised her. "There are people in this town," she said, "who are not going to like this, who are going to say things. I know. Martha Doyle is going to have something to say to everyone who'll listen. The Women's Auxiliary is going to have opinions. There are men who think you've made a mistake. I know that too. That doesn't concern you, Miss Holloway. He said it with a slight emphasis, and she understood he was about to say something he intended her to keep. I'm 46 years old. I have buried a wife and raised 2 children and built a cattle operation from 200 acres to 40,000. I have been in this territory long enough to know that the people who talk the loudest about other people's decisions are generally the ones most dissatisfied with their own. He paused. I stopped caring what those people think a long time ago. I suggest you consider doing the same. She looked at him sideways. That's easier said, she told him. Most things worth doing are. She thought about Martha Doyle's sharp eyes. She thought about the whispers that would start tomorrow, and the stories that would get told, and the way people in small places make sense of things that confuse them by reducing them to something manageable. The wealthy rancher gone soft. The plain woman who somehow tricked him, the arrangement that won't last. She knew exactly how it would go. She had watched it happen to other people. She also thought about the street this morning. About Whitaker standing there for 20 minutes with his hat in his hand, so more people would come, so the asking would mean more. About the look on Martha Doyle's face when Maggie had held her eyes and not looked away. About Roy's hand extended. About Earl's nod. About what it felt like to be seen by someone who looked for the right things. When, she said. That's your call. I'll need time to take it. She looked at him. Don't keep finishing my sentences before I finish them. Sorry. He didn't sound sorry. A month, she said. I need to put the house in order for Clara. Make sure she knows where things are, how Roy likes things run. I'm not going to leave a mess behind. A month is fine. And I want to meet your children before the wedding, both of them, separately. He nodded. I'll arrange it. And Mrs. Aldridge. Done. And I want it clearly understood. She paused, chose the words carefully. I am not coming to run your house for you. I am coming to be your wife. Those are not the same thing, and I will not have them confused. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Maggie. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Holloway. Maggie. Just like that, plain and certain, the way a person says the name of something they intend to keep. That, he said, is exactly what I want. The sun had climbed higher while they sat there, and the yard was bright and hot and entirely ordinary, the same fence, the same barn, the same patch of ground she had walked across 10,000 times in her life. Nothing about it had changed. Everything about it looked different. She stood up, brushed off her skirt. I have biscuits to start, she said. Of course you do. She went inside without looking back, but she was aware of him sitting on the step behind her, his quiet, steady presence, the fact of him, the impossible real fact of him, all the way to the kitchen door. Inside, Clara was at the table with Bobby on her knee, and when Maggie came in, Clara looked up with her eyes very bright and her expression barely contained. Don't, Maggie said. I'm not saying anything. You're about to. I'm just sitting here. Clara pressed her lips together. Then after a beat, He's wonderful, Maggie. Maggie got the flour out of the tin. He's a man, she said. I'm going to take the time to see exactly what kind. You already know, Clara said. Maggie did not answer that. She measured the flour and cut the lard in and worked the dough with the heels of her hands, the way she had done every morning of her adult life, and she let the familiar work anchor her, while the unfamiliar thing happening inside her chest continued to do what it was doing, regardless of whether she had given it permission. It had been a long morning. It had been the longest morning of 40 years. And outside on her brother's porch, the man who had stood in the middle of the street and said her name, where everyone could hear it, was sitting in the July heat, unhurried, waiting for nothing in particular, just being there the way he had apparently decided to be, which was solidly and without apology. Maggie pressed the dough flat and cut it into rounds and set them in the pan. She had said yes. She had meant it. And somewhere between the night she had spent telling herself not to hope and the morning she had spent discovering that some things don't wait for your permission, She had crossed a line she did not know she had been standing at. There was no going back across it. She found to her own surprise that she had no interest in going back. The biscuits were done by the time Whitaker rode out, and Maggie stood at the kitchen window and watched him go without letting herself assign any particular meaning to the way she watched. She had said yes. The yes was real. Everything else was just the work that came after a real yes, and Maggie Holloway had never in her life been afraid of work. What she was afraid of, she would not name yet. The month moved the way months do when a woman has too much to think about and not enough quiet to think it in fast on the surface, grinding slow underneath. The town talked, which she had expected. Martha Doyle talked loudest, which she had also expected. The story that circulated in the first week was that Nate Whitaker had lost his mind from grief, that a man of his standing had no business choosing a woman of Maggie's age and appearance, that something was wrong somewhere, and it would come out soon enough. Maggie heard versions of this through Earl, through Clara, through the particular silence that fell when she walked into the dry goods store and two women stopped talking mid-sentence. She let it go, the way she let most things go, not because it didn't sting, but because she had made a decision about what she was going to let take up space in her, and idle cruelty from small people had used enough of her years already. What took up space instead was this: Emma Whitaker was coming from Helena. Nate had sent the telegram the same afternoon they sat on Roy's porch. Emma's reply had come back in 2 days, which was fast, and the reply had been 3 words according to Nate when he told Maggie about it on his next visit. "What 3 words?" Maggie asked. He paused just long enough that she knew she wasn't going to like them. "I'll be there." Not "how wonderful, Father." Not "I'm so happy for you." 3 words that contained a period at the end, like a door being firmly closed. "She's coming to look me over," Maggie said. "She's coming because she loves her father." Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive, Nathaniel. He looked at her when she used his full name. She had started doing it when she meant something precisely, and he had caught on quickly. "No," he said. "They're not." "When?" "End of the week." Maggie nodded and went back to the pie she was making, and Nate sat at the kitchen table in Roy's house the way he had taken to doing on his visits, comfortable, unhurried, talking to her while she worked in a way that no man had ever done before. Not because he was trying to demonstrate something, but simply because he seemed to like being where she was. She had noticed this. She had not commented on it. She was still getting used to it. "Tell me about her," Maggie said. "Honestly, not the version designed to make me feel better." How was quiet for a moment. "Emma is the smartest person I know. Smarter than me, possibly. She's got her mother's way of seeing through things, not around them, through them, straight to the middle of what's true. She was 17 when her mother got sick. She spent 2 years doing what you do, holding everything together, while the rest of us didn't know how." A pause. "When her mother died, she grieved hard, and then she built a wall, and she's lived behind it since. Her husband is a good man, patient. He understands her." Another pause. "She loved her mother very much, and she's going to walk in and see me and think I'm trying to replace her." "Yes," he said. "Probably. I appreciate you not pretending otherwise. I told you, I lay things out plain." "You did tell me that." She crimped the pie edge without looking up. "And Thomas. Thomas is—" She heard him shift in the chair. "Thomas is harder to explain. He was 12 when his mother got sick and 14 when she died. That's a hard age for a boy to lose his mother." He went quiet afterward. Stayed quiet. "He works hard, he's respectful, he doesn't cause trouble. But he's got a wall too, just a different kind. Emma's wall has a door in it, even if you have to find it. Thomas's—" He stopped. "Thomas's doesn't," Maggie said. "I'm not sure yet. How long has it been closed?" 5 years. She set the pie pan aside, turned around and looked at him directly. "Has anyone tried? His teachers, his sister, me?" He met her eyes. "None of us have gotten very far." "Maybe," she said carefully. "You've all been trying too hard." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that a closed door and a locked door are different things. And sometimes people who've learned not to expect anything Stop defending against nothing. She turned back to the counter. I'm not saying I can help him. I'm saying don't count it impossible before it's had a chance. The chair scraped back slightly, and when she glanced over her shoulder, Nate Whitaker was looking at her with the expression she was starting to recognize, the one that looked like a man finding something he hadn't known he was looking for. She turned back to the counter and did not comment on it. Emma Whitaker arrived on Friday morning on the stage from Helena, and Maggie was at the Whitaker Ranch to meet her because Nate had asked, and Maggie had agreed, and she had spent the morning telling herself she was not nervous and mostly believing it. The house was large. She had known it would be large. 40,000 acres of operation required a house to match. But large was different from what she encountered when Nate brought her through the door 3 days earlier for her first visit. It was the kind of large that had once been a home and had since become simply a space. High ceilings and good furniture and everything in its correct position, maintained by Mrs. Aldridge with military efficiency, but with the particular absence of warmth that settles into a house when the person who made it warm is gone. Maggie had walked through it slowly, touching nothing, seeing everything, saying very little. Nate had watched her do it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking it has good bones," she said. And it misses someone." He had not answered that. He didn't need to. Mrs. Aldridge was a small, straight-backed woman of 55, who had survived 12 years of Whitaker employ through a combination of genuine competence and an almost supernatural ability to keep her thoughts off her face. She had greeted Maggie with perfect courtesy and a handshake that was slightly firmer than necessary, which told Maggie everything she needed to know about where they stood and that they would be fine eventually. Women who expressed their reservations directly were always easier to work with than the ones who smiled while maneuvering. "Mrs. Aldridge," Maggie said, "I want to be clear with you about something." "Of course, Miss Holloway. I am not coming into this house to run your kitchen or revise your systems. You know this house better than I do, and I intend to respect that. What I need from you is patience while I learn, and honesty when I get something wrong. In return, I'll give you the same." She paused. "I've managed a household for 20 years. I know what it takes. I also know when I'm the new person in someone else's domain, and I don't intend to forget it." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a moment with those carefully neutral eyes. "I think," she said, "that we will get along fine, Miss Holloway." That had been 3 days ago. Now Maggie stood in the main room of the house waiting for Emma, with Nate beside her, and Thomas somewhere behind her. She had felt him come in, had not turned around, had decided that turning around to look at a 19-year-old boy who didn't trust strangers was exactly the wrong way to start. She heard the stage before she saw it. Heard the door, heard Nate go to meet it, heard a woman's voice, low, clear, with the particular precision of someone who had learned to control every word before releasing it. Then Emma Whitaker walked in. She was 22 years old, and she looked like a woman who had been 40 since she was 15. Dark-haired like her father, with her mother's face in some arrangement, Maggie couldn't identify because she'd never seen her mother. She was not a large woman. She was not a small one. She was exactly the size of someone who took up whatever space she decided to take, and no more. Her eyes went to Maggie immediately, and stayed there, and they were gray like Nate's, but with something sharper in them, a kind of direct assessment that was not rude, but was completely unapologetic. "You must be Miss Holloway," Emma said. "I am, and you must be Emma." Maggie extended her hand. "Your father has told me a great deal about you." Emma shook the hand. Her grip was firm. "I imagine he has." She glanced at her father briefly. Briefly, something passed between them that was old and complicated, then back to Maggie. "I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing." "I was hoping you'd say that." Nate looked at his daughter, then at Maggie. "I'll see to the bags," he said, which was what a smart man said when two women needed a room. Thomas had disappeared. Maggie had noticed. Emma sat down in one of the chairs by the cold fireplace, and Maggie sat across from her, and neither of them performed any more courtesy than was necessary. It was, Maggie thought, one of the more honest social situations she had been in. "I'm going to be direct with you," Emma said. "Please. I don't know you. I don't know what you want from my father. I know what my father thinks he knows about you, and I know my father is a good man who has been lonely for 4 years and may not be thinking at his clearest. She paused. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to be honest. You're being both, Maggie said. I don't object to either. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, more in recalibration. She had expected Maggie guessed something more defensive. He says he's watched you for 4 years. That's what he told me too. Does that not seem unusual to you? What would you prefer, that he'd known me 2 weeks? Maggie held her gaze. I've lived in this valley my entire life. Your father lives 40 minutes ride from where I grew up. In a place this size, 4 years of watching someone work is more than most married couples know about each other. A silence. Emma's hands were folded in her lap, very still. My mother was... She was not a replaceable person. No person is replaceable, Maggie said. I'm not trying to be your mother. I am 40 years old and I have never had children, and I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not, to make this easier for either of us. What I can tell you is that I will not disrespect her memory. I will not try to erase what she built in this house. And I will not ask you to be comfortable with me before you're ready. The silence stretched longer this time. Thomas isn't going to make this easy, Emma said. I know. He shuts people out. He's been doing it for years. I know that too. And that doesn't... Emma stopped, started again. What are you going to do about it? Nothing, Maggie said. Emma stared at her. Nothing. Nothing aggressive, nothing designed, nothing that looks like a strategy. Maggie kept her voice level. I'm going to be in the house. I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to do what I do and be who I am, and when he's ready, if he's ready, the door will be open. But I've learned enough about closed people to know that pushing only closes them further. She paused. Your father can't help him with this. You can't help him with this. Sometimes the only person who can reach someone is the one they haven't had a reason to build a wall against yet. Emma was looking at her in a way she hadn't looked at her before. Something had shifted, small but real. You've thought about this, Emma said. I think about most things. Another silence. Then Emma said something that Maggie had not expected. Are you frightened? Yes, Maggie said immediately. Emma blinked. I'm 40 years old, and I've lived one kind of life my entire life, and I'm about to live an entirely different one, Maggie said. I would be a fool not to be frightened. But being frightened and being uncertain are different things. I'm not uncertain. She held Emma's eyes. Your father is a good man. I am clear-eyed about what he is. I am not a woman who mistakes kindness for character. I've known too many kind men without character to confuse the two. Your father has both. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Maggie could hear the sounds of the house around them. Mrs. Aldridge, somewhere toward the back footsteps on the upper floor, the wind against the walls. I'm not going to tell you I'm comfortable with this, Emma said finally. I'm not asking you to be. I'm going to need time. Take whatever you need. And I'm going to... Emma stopped, looked at her hands, then back up. I'm going to be watching, not in a threatening way, but I need to see who you are when things are hard, not when they're easy. That's fair, Maggie said. That's exactly right. Something moved in Emma's face. She didn't say anything else, but something moved, and Maggie recognized it because she had felt it herself in the past 3 weeks. The feeling of deciding quietly to leave a door open, just barely. Not all the way, just barely. It was enough. Nate came back in, read the room the way he read most things, fast, quietly, accurately, and sat down without asking how it went. Thomas is in the barn, he said. I know, Maggie said. You don't have to. I'm not going to the barn, she said. I'm going to ask Mrs. Aldridge if I can help with supper. He looked at her. Leave him alone, she said quietly. For now, just leave him. She stood and went toward the kitchen, and behind her she heard Emma say to her father, in a voice low enough that it wasn't meant to carry, but it carried, "She's not what I expected." And Nate said, "No, she's not what anyone expects." Supper was the 4 of them at the long table, Nate at the head. Emma across from Maggie, Thomas, at the far end in a chair he had pulled several inches back from the table when he thought no one was looking. Maggie had noticed. She said nothing. Thomas Whitaker was 19 years old, and he had his mother's eyes probably. Maggie had no way to know for certain, but they were not his father's gray. They were lighter, almost amber, and they were fixed on his plate with the focused intensity of a boy who has made a study of being invisible in his own home. He was not unkind at the table. He answered when spoken to. He said please and thank you and passed things without being asked. He was on the surface perfectly present. Underneath, he was somewhere else entirely. Maggie watched him the way she watched most things she was trying to understand without appearing to, through the kind of attention that doesn't announce itself. Thomas, Nate said at one point, Miss Holloway was telling me she's been managing the Holloway operation for nearly 20 years. The East Pasture system Roy uses, apparently, that was her design. Thomas looked up. Quick reflexive a flicker of something across his face before he smoothed it back. Yes, Maggie said casually, not looking at him. Roy thought it was his idea. I let him think that. Easier. She took a bite. Men think more clearly when they think they've already decided something. Emma made a sound that was possibly a laugh. She covered it with her napkin. Nate was looking at Maggie with the expression she was getting used to, the one that seemed to say, there you are. There's the thing I knew was there. Thomas said nothing, but he pulled his chair 2 inches back toward the table. Maggie did not look at him when he did it. The week moved. The wedding date was set 3 weeks out because Maggie's month was nearly done, and there was no reason to extend it. Reverend Price would perform the ceremony. It would be small. Both of them had agreed on that without much discussion. Nate, because he was a private man. Maggie, because the idea of a large celebration felt like tempting something, and she was still underneath the yes and the biscuits and the pragmatic conversations about household management. Holding her breath a little, she did not know when she would stop holding it. She suspected it would not be at the wedding. It might not be for months. Emma stayed for 5 days, and each day was slightly different from the last in ways that were subtle but real. By the 3rd day, she was drinking her morning coffee at the kitchen table while Maggie worked, which Maggie understood to mean something. By the 4th day, she had asked almost offhandedly, watching the rim of her cup, what Maggie thought of the library system in Helena. By the 5th day, when she was packing to leave, she came to find Maggie in the kitchen and said without preamble, I'm going to write to you, if that's acceptable. Maggie looked up. I'd like that. Emma nodded once briskly, the nod of a woman who had made a decision and intended to stand by it without making a production of it. Then she said even more quietly, She would have liked you, I think, my mother. Maggie set down what she was holding. That is the kindest thing, she said, you could have said to me. Emma's jaw tightened briefly, emotion held in the family way. Don't make it into more than it is. But her voice had something in it that hadn't been there on the first day. I won't, Maggie said. Emma left at noon. Thomas drove her to the stage and came back alone, and Maggie saw him come in through the front and go directly upstairs without passing through the kitchen, which was what he always did. She was learning his patterns the way she learned most things, by paying attention without pressure, mapping the shape of a person's habits before deciding what they meant. 2 days before the wedding, she was alone in the main room, sorting through the linens Mrs. Aldridge had brought down for her inspection, when she heard someone on the stairs. She did not look up. Footsteps crossed the room, stopped. She kept sorting. Miss Holloway. Thomas's voice. The first time he had come to her, rather than waiting to be in the same room by accident. She looked up without making it a moment. Thomas. Howe was standing in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it did, composed, careful, giving nothing away. He was looking at the linens. Those are my mother's, he said. Mrs. Aldridge brought them for the guest rooms, she said. Do you want them put back? He looked at her, a beat of silence. No, he said. They've been in the chest for 4 years. He looked back at the linens. She would have thought that was wasteful. I think so too, Maggie said. Another silence. Emma says... He stopped, started again. Emma says you're straightforward. I try to be. She doesn't say that about people. He looked at his hands. Emma doesn't say much good about people she doesn't know. It takes her a while. She was honest with me, Maggie said. I respect that. I was quiet for long enough that she went back to the linens. She was not going to fill the silence for him. She had learned that about Thomas in a week. He needed the silence to have space in it, to not be covered over with helpful words that were actually just pressure wearing a friendly face. I'm not going to... He started and stopped again, and she heard in it the particular struggle of a young man who has decided to say something real and is having trouble with the actual mechanics of saying it. I'm not trying to be difficult. I know you're not. I just... He looked up at her, and for the first time his face was not composed. It was just a 19-year-old boy who missed his mother and didn't know what to do about a world that kept moving without her. I just need it to go slow. Then it'll go slow, Maggie said. You're not going to try to fix things. Push. No. Most people push. I'm not most people. She held his eyes. And you're not a Project Thomas. You're a person. I don't fix people. I just show up. That's all I know how to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the linens. The blue ones were her favorites, he said. The ones with the edging. Then we'll use those in the good rooms, Maggie said. He nodded, started to turn. Thomas? He paused. Thank you for telling me that, she said. He didn't say anything, but he didn't walk away fast, and that was its own kind of thing. The wedding was on a Tuesday, because Reverend Price had a burial on Saturday and a baptism on Sunday, and Nate Whitaker saw no reason to wait for a more ceremonial day. Maggie had agreed. She had never been particularly attached to ceremony. It was outcomes she cared about, not the theater around them. She wore the blue dress Clara had helped her make, which was the nicest thing she had owned in years, and which fit her well, and which she had let herself feel good about, despite 3 separate comments from women in town that had attempted to determine otherwise. She had fixed her hair the way she liked it, not the way anyone else had an opinion about. She had put on the earrings her mother left her. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her narrow room for a moment before she left. The woman in the mirror was 40 years old and heavy-set, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes from 2 decades of working in sun and wind. She was not young. She was not the kind of woman people wrote songs about or hung paintings of. She was in the language of the world ordinary. She was also, she thought, exactly who she was. That was going to have to be enough. She believed for the first time in a long time that it was. Roy drove her to the church. He didn't say much on the way, which was how she knew he felt a great deal. When he handed her down from the wagon at the church steps, he held her hand a beat longer than necessary. You deserve this, he said. I should have said that a long time ago. You're saying it now, she said. It doesn't fix... Roy. She squeezed his hand once. It counts for something. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the thing she had always known was there, underneath the self-absorption, and the borrowed money, and the years of not quite seeing her. He loved her. He had always loved her. He simply hadn't known how to show it in any way that cost him something. That was a limitation, not a verdict. She went up the steps. Inside the church, there were 14 people, Roy and Clara with Bobby Earl in his best jacket sitting in the first pew, like a man who has arrived at something. He has been waiting for Mrs. Aldridge with her hands folded and her face not quite neutral, Davies in the back with his hat on his knee. Thomas sat beside Earl. He had come without being asked. And at the front, Nate Whitaker stood with his hat in his hand and his face doing the thing it did, steady, certain, present. He turned when she came down the aisle. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was the thing he was paying attention to. Not the dress. Not the occasion. Her. She walked to him and stood beside him, and Reverend Price opened his book and began. And outside the wind was moving against the walls, and the light was coming through the windows, the way Montana light comes in summer, white and flat and absolute. She listened to the words. They were old words worn smooth from use, but they meant what they meant, and she let them mean it. When Reverend Price asked if she took this man, she said, I do, and she meant both words with equal weight. When Nate's ring went on her finger, his grandmother's ring, which he had told her about, and which she had accepted, because it came from a real place and not a performance. She felt it settle there with a strange certainty, like a key that had found its lock without either of them forcing it. Reverend Price said the words that ended the ceremony. Nate Whitaker looked at his wife. "Hello, Maggie," he said quietly. Only to her. She had held herself together through 40 years of being overlooked. She had held herself together through the proposal and the public square, and Emma's sharp assessment, and Thomas's careful distance, and Roy's late guilt, and the whole complicated mountain of becoming a different kind of person than she had decided she was. She held herself together now, but only just. "Hello, Nathaniel," she said. Behind her Earl. Beckwith made a sound she had never heard from him before, something that from a man with less dignity would have been called a sniffle. Thomas beside him was looking at his hands. Mrs. Aldridge was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a woman absolutely determined not to be moved. Clara was already crying and not bothering to pretend she wasn't. Roy put his arm around his wife and looked at his sister with the face of a man who understands. Understands finally, and too late, and just in time, what he was looking at all along. Outside the church, the world was exactly the same as it had been when Maggie walked in. Same town, same road, same hard Montana summer pressing down on everything without mercy. She walked out of it differently. Not because everything had changed. Because she had finally stopped waiting for permission to take up the space that had always been hers. She walked out on the arm of the man who had seen that before she did, into a life that was just beginning with all its difficulties and adjustments, and Thomas's closed door, and Emma's careful watching, and Mrs. Aldridge's reserved judgment, and everything else that was real and hard, and hers. All of it hers. She had waited 40 years for that word to apply to something that mattered. It was about time. The first morning Maggie woke up in the Whitaker house, she lay still for 60 seconds and listened. The house had sounds she didn't know yet. The particular creak of the upper hallway when the temperature shifted. The way the kitchen pipe knocked twice before the water ran clear. The sound Thomas's boots made on the back stairs heavier on the right footlighter on the left. A pattern she had noticed in her first week and filed away without comment. She was learning the house the way she learned most things, by paying attention before she did anything else. She got up dressed and went to the kitchen before Mrs. Aldridge. This was not a power move. She had thought carefully about how it would read and decided it was simply who she was. She had risen before everyone else. Her entire adult life, and stopping now would have felt like pretending. She started the fire, set the coffee on, and was mixing biscuit dough when Mrs. Aldridge came through the door 7 minutes later and stopped. They looked at each other. "I'm not taking over your kitchen," Maggie said. "I couldn't sleep and my hands needed something to do." Mrs. Aldridge looked at the biscuits, then at the coffee, then at Maggie. "You use lard or butter?" "Lard. Butter makes them too rich for breakfast." Something shifted in Mrs. Aldridge's face, the smallest recalibration nearly invisible. "That's how Mr. Whitaker's mother made them," she said. "Then we're starting right?" Maggie said. Mrs. Aldridge tied her apron and picked up the egg basket without further discussion, and that was the moment, quiet, domestic, unremarkable, that the two of them decided they were going to be fine. Nate came down at 6:30 and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw both women working in what was clearly an established rhythm already. He looked at Maggie. She handed him his coffee without turning around. "How did you—" "Black, no sugar. You held your cup wrong every time it was sweet." He laughed, that low, genuine sound she was becoming familiar with. He took the coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and Maggie registered with the part of herself she was still getting used to that this was what mornings were going to be. This ordinary, impossible thing. Thomas came down at 7. He looked at the table, at his father, at Maggie at the stove, and did his usual calculation. The one she could see him running every time he entered a room. She was in the quiet arithmetic of a boy, deciding how much to invest in the moment. He sat down, poured himself coffee. "Biscuits smell right," he said. "Not to anyone in particular, just to the room." "Your grandmother's recipe, apparently," Maggie said. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Aldridge told you that." "She did." A pause. Something moved in his amber eyes. "She never makes them," he said. "Says she can't get them right." "Different hands," Maggie said. "Same dough usually just needs a different touch." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his cup and said almost to himself, "She made them every Sunday." "Your grandmother. My mother." He said it straight, not cautiously, the first time he had said the word to her without armor around it. Every Sunday without fail, even when she was sick. The kitchen went very still. Maggie set the pan in the oven and turned around, leaning against the counter. She did not make it soft. She did not reach for the easy comfort. "She sounds like the kind of woman who believed showing up mattered more than feeling like it," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." He looked back at his coffee. But his chair had moved forward again, both inches this time. Nate met Maggie's eyes across the kitchen, and she shook her head slightly. "Don't say anything," and he nodded and looked at his coffee. And that silent exchange was, she thought, the first genuinely married thing they had done. The biscuits came out right. The weeks settled into a shape. Maggie was careful about how she moved through the house, not timid, not aggressive, just deliberate. She asked before she changed things. She explained her reasons when she did. Mrs. Aldridge thawed in increments first, the biscuits, then a conversation about the cold cellar organization. Then a morning when she came to Maggie with a supply list and said, "I'd like your thoughts on this before I take it to town," which was not a small thing. The ranch hands were a different matter. 18 men had their own opinions about who belonged where, and a new wife arriving in the big house was to several of them either a threat to a comfortable arrangement or a source of entertainment. Maggie dealt with them the same way she had dealt with Roy's men for 20 years, by being competent, consistent, and impossible to rattle. The one called Hicks tried her first. Hicks was 30-something capable, and had apparently decided that his familiarity with the Whitaker operation gave him some authority over its new addition. He came to the kitchen door on her 4th day and asked for something in a tone that sat just on the wrong side of respectful, watching her face to see what she would do with it. She handed him what he asked for and said pleasantly, "Hicks, if you come to my kitchen door with that tone again, you'll get what you came for after everyone else. Are we clear?" He stared at her. "I'm not unreasonable," she said, same tone. "I'm just specific about how I'm spoken to. It's a small thing, shouldn't be a problem." I took what he came for and left. 2 days later, he held the barn door for her without being asked. A week after that, he told Davies that the new Mrs. Whitaker was all right, which Davies relayed to Nate, who relayed it to Maggie with some amusement. "High praise," he said. "Hicks took 3 days," she said. "I expected a week." He looked at her. "You expected him to come test you. I expected all of them to. Men test things that are new. It's not personal." She paused. "I just make sure the test is quick." He shook his head with the expression she was learning to read, not quite disbelief, something closer to the feeling of being consistently surprised by someone you already respect. She was getting used to being looked at that way. She was not entirely sure she would ever stop finding it startling. It was in the 5th week that she found the account books. She had not been looking for them. Nate managed the ranch finances through Davies and a land agent in Billings named Carver, and she had not inserted herself into that because she had enough to learn without adding the books on top of it. But Mrs. Aldridge had asked her to find the household ledger in Nate's office, and while she was looking, she pulled out the wrong book and opened it to the wrong page, and what she saw made her sit down in the office chair and read for 20 minutes straight. She closed the book. She opened it again and read 3 more pages. She closed it again and sat with her hands flat on the cover. Then she went to find Nate. Howe was in the north field with Davies, and she waited at the fence rather than interrupt, which cost her 20 minutes of standing in the heat, telling herself she might be wrong. She was not wrong. She had kept Roy's books for 12 years, and she knew what a set of accounts looked like when someone was moving money through them in ways that were designed not to be noticed. She knew what legitimate expenses looked like, and she knew what false entries looked like, and she had just read 40 pages of the second kind, mixed into the first with what she had to admit was some skill. "Nate." She said it when he reached the fence without preamble. He saw her face. "What happened?" "I need you to come to the office." Davies started to follow. Nate said, "Give us a few minutes," and Davies stopped. In the office, she put the book on the desk and opened it to the first page she had marked with a slip of paper and pointed. He read. She watched his face. It did not collapse. It went still, not the stillness of a man who is surprised, but the stillness of a man who is recognizing something he has been half aware of and has just been handed the proof. Carver, he said. I think so. The entries here and here. She pointed. These are for supplies that don't match the delivery records. And this one, she turned 3 pages. This is a payment to a company I don't recognize, but the amount and the timing match a bill of sale that went through for the Southwest water rights last year. The water rights transaction. He was reading fast now, tracking with a finger. I thought that was a clean deal. So did I until I saw this. She turned 2 more pages. Nate, how long has Carver handled your accounts? 7 years. And you trusted him? I trusted Davies's recommendation, and I trusted the books. He looked up at her. How long has this been happening? She had been calculating since she sat down in the office chair. Based on what I can trace in these pages, at minimum 2 years, possibly 3. She held his gaze. I don't know how much. It'll take me more time with the full set of ledgers to know what we're dealing with. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, Can you do that? Go through all of it? I've kept books for 20 years. I can do it. He looked at her, and this was a different look than the others, not the one of being surprised or moved. This was the look of a man who had just realized he needed something specific and found it already standing in front of him. How long? How long, he said. 3 days if you can keep everyone out of this office. Done. She spent 3 days at that desk. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was the quality of mind that had kept Roy's failing operation afloat longer than it deserved the ability to see all the numbers and understand what they were hiding as well as what they were showing. She went through 7 years of Carver's work with a patience that she felt as almost physical, each page adding to the picture, each false entry exposing a little more of the shape of what had been done. When she was finished, she sat back and looked at the total. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that if she'd found it in Roy's books, would have meant losing the ranch. Here in the Whitaker operation, it was serious, but not fatal. Nate's operation was large enough to absorb it, which was possibly exactly why Carver had thought it safe. A man wealthy enough not to notice was the most convenient man to steal from. She went to Nate with the full accounting on a Tuesday evening. He read it in silence. Davies stood in the corner. Thomas had been told to leave the room and had left without argument, which told Maggie he understood more about what was happening than he'd let on. When Nate finished reading, he looked at Davies. Davies's face was gray. I recommended him, he said. I know you did, and I know you didn't know. Nate's voice was flat and certain. Don't go down that road, Robert. I'm not interested in blame right now. He looked at Maggie. What do we do? She had thought about this for 3 days. Not just the numbers, the strategy. What a woman of 40 years' experience watching men make decisions would advise if anyone had ever thought to ask her. You go to the Territorial Land Office first, she said. Before you go to Carver. You bring this, she set her organized summary on top of the ledgers. And you file a formal complaint with evidence already in hand. You don't give him time to move anything or alter any records he still has access to. She paused. And you contact the attorney in Billings, not Carver's attorney, someone else today, before tomorrow morning. Nate was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Something beyond the familiar warmth and attention. Something more deliberate. You've thought through all of this, he said. I've had 3 days. You've also never done this before. I've watched enough things go wrong to know how they go right. She met his eyes. I'm not guessing, Nate. I'm certain. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Davies, get the horses. What happened over the following week moved fast in the way that legal matters move when the evidence is solid and the injured party has resources. The attorney in Billings, a sharp-faced man named Gould, who came recommended through the land office, spent 2 hours with Maggie's summary and the ledgers and came out of the meeting with the look of a man who has been handed a cleaner case than he expected. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, did you prepare this yourself? I did. With respect to the quality of this accounting, you missed one thing. 1. He turned to page 42 and pointed. This entry here cross-references an account number that doesn't appear elsewhere. It may be a separate vehicle for funds. We'll need to investigate. She looked at the entry. She had flagged it and then moved on because she couldn't trace it. I saw it, she said. I couldn't follow it. I can follow it. He looked at her with the frank appreciation of a professional, recognizing competence. Where did you learn to read accounts like this? 20 years of necessity, she said. He nodded. Carver is going to have a bad month, he said, and it was the most satisfied she had heard a lawyer sound. Carver was confronted 3 days later. He denied everything for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took Gould to lay the organized evidence on the table in front of him. After the 4th minute, Carver's attorney leaned over and said something in his ear, and Carver's face changed. He confessed to 2 years. Gould pressed him on 3. The full accounting that came out over the next 2 weeks confirmed Maggie's original estimate. 3 years the hidden account that Gould had traced, and a secondary arrangement with a supplier that had inflated invoices at a cut of 15% for 2 years running. The total was significant. Not devastating, but significant. And it would be returned. Nate came home from the final meeting with the land office on a Thursday evening and found Maggie in the kitchen with Mrs. Aldridge, where they had taken to working in the late afternoons in a companionable and largely silent way that had become its own kind of friendship. He stood in the doorway. It's done, he said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at Nate. How much is recoverable? She asked. Most of it. Gould thinks 90% over time through the property Carver used as collateral. He paused. The land office judge wants to speak with you. She frowned. With me? He asked specifically. He wants the person who produced the accounting to come in. He looked at her steadily. Apparently Gould told him who found it. Gould talks too much, she said. Or exactly enough, Nate said. She went to the land office the following morning. The judge, a compact, serious man named Harlow, who had been adjudicating territorial matters for 12 years, looked at her across his desk with the particular attention of a man who has heard something and wants to verify it for himself. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, you identified a fraud of this scale in 72 hours. I had 3 days, she said. My office has had 2 examiners looking at Carver's accounts for a year. He paused. They found one discrepancy. She did not say anything to that. I'm curious, he said. What made you look? I pulled the wrong book by accident, she said. He studied her. And if you hadn't, someone would have found it eventually. It was getting less careful. That happens when a man starts feeling safe. She paused. Men who steal get comfortable. Comfortable men get sloppy. The entries in the last 6 months were almost careless compared to the first year. Harlow looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Whitaker, are you interested in work? She blinked. I beg your pardon. Consulting work, for this office. I have 3 other territorial operations under review that my examiners have been struggling with. He folded his hands on the desk. Your name is going to be talked about after this. I'd rather put that to use than let it sit. She sat very still. In 40 years, no one had ever offered her work. They had accepted it, expected it, occasionally thanked her for it. No one had ever offered it with a value attached with the formality of a professional proposition. I'd need to discuss it with my husband, she said. Of course. She came home and told Nate at supper. Thomas was there, and he looked up from his plate when she started talking and did not look back down. When she finished, Nate was quiet. What do you want to do? He said. I want to know what you think. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. 40 years of being asked what she could give, what she could do for someone else, what they needed from her. One man asking what she wanted. I think I want to do it, she said. Then do it. Thomas said from the end of the table, not looking up from his plate. He'd be stupid not to use you. The table went quiet. Maggie looked at the boy. He was looking at his food with studied casualness, but his jaw was slightly set in the way it got when he had said more than he intended. Thank you, Thomas, she said. "It's just true," he said. But when he reached for the bread, he passed it to her first without being asked, without making anything of it. The way you pass bread to someone who belongs at your table. Nate saw it. She saw him see it. Neither of them said a word. Later that evening, when the house had settled, and Nate was at his desk, and Mrs. Aldridge had gone to her room, Maggie was at the kitchen table with a letter from Emma III, in as many weeks, each one slightly warmer than the last, each one asking slightly more specific questions. The questions of a woman lowering a wall, one careful brick at a time. This letter ended with a sentence that Maggie read 3 times. "I told my husband about what you did with the accounts. He said you must be remarkable. I told him I was beginning to think so too." She folded the letter. Thomas's boots came down the back stairs, heavy right light left, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the letter in her hands, not asking. "Emma," he said. "Yes." "She writes you now." "She does." He leaned against the doorframe. He was 19 and trying to look like a man, and mostly succeeding except in these late-night moments when the house was quiet and the effort cost more than he had. "She doesn't write people," he said. "She never wrote me more than twice a year." Maybe she didn't have much to say to you that she hadn't already said. He considered this. Or maybe you're easier to talk to. "I'm told I listen well. Do you—" He looked at her, not hostile, genuinely asking. "Or do you just wait for people to stop talking?" She met his eyes. "Both depending on what's needed." He almost smiled. It was not all the way there, but the muscles moved in the direction of it. "That's honest," he said. "I try to be." He pushed off the doorframe, started toward the stairs, stopped. "Miss Holloway," he said, and she did not correct him to Mrs. Whitaker, because he had said it with something in it that was not disrespect, but was its own kind of trying its own careful offering, and she would not rush what was already moving. "Yes, Thomas." "The biscuits." He looked at the wall instead of her. "If you make them Sunday, the same way, I'd—" He stopped, started again. "That would be fine." She waited until she was sure he was up the stairs and out of earshot. Then she sat at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. 40 years of being the woman nobody chose. 40 years of making biscuits in someone else's kitchen, for someone else's family, toward someone else's future. And now this. This quiet, complicated, real thing. A judge who wanted her work. An operation saved by her eyes. A daughter-in-law writing letters that were getting longer. A boy who asked for Sunday biscuits in his mother's recipe, like it was a treaty negotiation, and he was not entirely sure of the terms. A man upstairs in an office who had asked her what she wanted, and then stepped back and let her have it. She had thought for a long time that the life she was living was the life she was meant for. That the narrow room, and the borrowed kitchen, and the years of useful invisibility were simply the shape of things. She had made her peace with that shape. She had called it enough. She understood now that it had never been enough. She had simply run out of the energy to want more. Nate Whitaker had given her the energy back, not by rescuing her, not by providing something she had been lacking, by seeing clearly what was already there and standing in front of the whole town and saying so. That was the thing. That was the whole thing distilled down. She had not been made new. She had been recognized. And recognition after 40 years of invisibility was its own kind of resurrection. She got up and put the letter away and went to turn down the lamps. Tomorrow she would send word to Judge Harlow that she accepted the work. Tomorrow she would make a list of what the first consulting review would require and how she would approach it and what she needed from the land office to do it right. Tomorrow Thomas would come down to breakfast and she would not make more of it than it was, and he would eat his eggs and say little and push his chair forward another inch, and that would be enough for tomorrow. But tonight, in the quiet of a house that was learning to be warm again, Maggie Whitaker stood in the kitchen that had become hers. Not by inheritance, not by default, but by choice, and by earning it, and by someone choosing her back, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had changed. It was heavy. Good things often were. She turned down the last lamp. She went upstairs. she went home. Sunday biscuits became a fixed point. Not discussed. Not announced. Just there every Sunday morning, the same dough worked with the same hands, the blue-edged linens on the table, because Thomas had said once that they were his mother's favorites, and Maggie had never put them away again. Thomas came down first now before his father, before Mrs. Aldridge. He poured his own coffee and sat at the table and did not say much, but he was there, which was its own language, and Maggie had learned to speak it. It was on the 6th Sunday that he said without looking up from his cup, "You're good at not pushing." "I've had practice," she said. "With who?" "With everyone." She turned the dough. People who've been hurt don't need more pressure. They need time and consistency. Most people can't offer both. They get impatient. He was quiet for a moment. "My father's not patient." "Your father is patient about the right things and impatient about others. That's different from being patient." She glanced at him. "He waited 4 years to ask me anything. That required patience." "He watched you for 4 years," Thomas said, and something in his tone was not quite accusation, but was circling it. "Doesn't that seem strange to you?" "A little," she said honestly. "But so does standing in the middle of a street with your hat in your hand. He does things his way. I've decided to trust the way." Thomas turned his cup in his hands. "How do you decide to trust someone?" She stopped working the dough. This was a real question. She treated it like one. "You watch what they do when it costs them something," she said. "Anyone can be decent when it's easy. What a person does when being decent is expensive, that's the test." He looked up at her. "And my father passed." He stood in the street, Thomas, in front of everyone. For a woman the whole town thought he had no business choosing. She met his eyes. That cost him something. He paid it without flinching. She went back to the dough. "That's how I decided." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was done. Then, "I want to trust people. I just don't know how to start." "You already started," she said. When you asked for Sunday biscuits." He looked at his coffee. Something moved in his face, the same movement she had seen the day he told her about the blue-edged linens, when whatever lived behind his eyes came briefly to the surface before he could get it back under. How was getting slower at getting it back under? She had noticed. I didn't say anything else. But he stayed at the table until the biscuits came out of the oven, and he ate 3 of them, and when he left he said, "See you next Sunday," which was the first time he had ever implied a future in her presence like it was a given. She waited until she heard his boots on the back stairs before she let herself feel what that meant. The consulting work for Judge Harlow started on a Monday in late September, and it was harder and better than she expected. The first file was a ranching operation in the eastern part of the territory, where 3 years of contested land surveys had produced a tangle of ownership claims that had already defeated 2 territorial examiners. Harlow gave it to her with the expression of a man who was testing something and wanted to know what he had. She took it home. She spent 4 evenings at the kitchen table after supper, Nate across from her reading his own papers, the 2 of them companionably separate the way people are when they trust the silence between them. On the 4th evening she looked up and said, "The problem is the 1891 survey." Nate looked up from his papers. "The first examiner went looking for fraud," she said. "The second one went looking for error. Neither of them went looking for duplication. But the 1891 survey was run twice. Different crews, different weeks, and someone filed both sets of results under different case numbers, so they never got compared." She turned the file toward him. "Look at these 2 parcel descriptions." He looked. He read them twice. They're the same parcel, filed as different ones, which is why every subsequent claim built on top of them has been contradicting itself. The land isn't in dispute. The paperwork is. She sat back. If you reconcile the 2 1891 filings, every claim downstream resolves itself automatically. Nate looked at the file, then at her. "How long did the 2 examiners work on this?" "Combined 7 months. "You did it in 4 evenings. "They were looking for something complicated," she said. "I looked for something simple first. Simple errors create complicated problems. It's usually the simple thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Maggie. Don't. I haven't said anything. You're about to say something that sounds like amazement, and I'd rather you didn't. I'm just doing what I've always done. Nobody asked me to do it in a professional capacity before. She gathered the file. That's the only difference. He looked at her steadily. I was going to say you should charge Harlow more. She stopped. Oh. He picked up his papers again. He's getting a bargain. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the file, and she was smiling, and she let herself. She brought the file to Harlow. The following morning, walked him through the 1891 duplication, and watched his face go through several things in quick succession, confusion, then understanding. Then the particular expression of a man confronting something obvious he missed. 4 days, he said. I had evenings free, she said. Mrs. Whitaker. He folded his hands. I have 7 more files like this one. I suspected you might. My budget for consulting work is Judge Harlow. She looked at him with the same pleasant directness she had used on Hicks and on Martha Doyle's sharp eyes, and on every person who had attempted to define her terms for her. My husband told me to charge you more. I think he's right. Would you like to discuss what fair compensation looks like, or would you like me to take the 7 files and we can talk about it when I bring them back? He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed a real laugh, the surprised kind. Take the files, he said, and name your price. She named it. He agreed without negotiating, which told her she had named it too low, but she would adjust next time. Everything was adjustable. That was another thing she was learning about this new life. Almost nothing was fixed the way she had thought things were fixed. She had operated for 40 years inside a set of walls she had assumed were permanent, and now she kept walking through them and finding they had always been paper. It was in October that the drought began in earnest. She had seen Montana droughts before. The territory didn't have gentle seasons, only seasons of varying difficulty. But this one had the particular quality of something intended to break people. 3 consecutive weeks without rain, then a 4th. The river dropped. The stock ponds went shallow. The grass on the east pasture crisped and crumbled underfoot. The ranches that had been struggling before the drought, and there were several, including 2 that Maggie knew from her years of tending their sick and feeding their hungry, started to fail. She heard about it first from Earl, who rode out on a Sunday to see her, because he said Roy's kitchen wasn't the same without her, but what he actually wanted was to tell her that the Calvert operation was down to 8 head, and Hank Calvert was talking about selling to Driscoll. Driscoll, Maggie said. That's what I heard. She set her coffee down. Driscoll was a land consolidator from Billings who had been moving through the territory for 2 years, buying distressed operations at prices that weren't quite fair, but were better than nothing, and then folding the land into larger parcels for resale at significant profit. He was not illegal. He was not cruel. He was simply the kind of man who understood that other people's desperation was to the right mind an opportunity. How many operations is he looking at right now? She asked Earl. Calvert Henderson and I heard the Pruitt boy might be next, maybe more. How much time does Calvert have? Hank said end of the month if the river doesn't come back. She was quiet for a moment. Then, is Roy all right? The agreement with Whitaker helped. He's tight, but he's not going under. Earl paused. You helped him, Maggie. That arrangement you negotiated, the grazing clause. He's using that. She nodded. She had written the grazing clause language herself on the kitchen table the night before Roy and Nate finalized the agreement. Neither man had asked her to. She had simply seen where the weakness was and fixed it. After Earl left, she went to find Nate. He was with Davies going over the water rotation schedule for the southern pasture, and she waited at the fence the way she had learned, not interrupting, but present enough that he knew she was there and what it meant. He came to her in 4 minutes. Calvert's going to sell to Driscoll, she said. I know. Davies told me yesterday. Henderson too. And possibly Pruitt. I know. If Driscoll consolidates those 3 operations, the water access on the eastern corridor shifts. It affects your north pasture rotation. She paused. And it puts 3 families off their land. Nate was watching her face. What are you thinking? She had been thinking it since Earl left. She had been building it in her mind, the way she built everything. Structure first, then fill. A shared resource arrangement, she said. 4 or 5 operations including yours. Pool the water access from the existing sources. Rotate grazing on a scheduled basis. Share the cost of maintaining the infrastructure. Spread the weight across multiple operations instead of leaving each one to carry it alone. She met his eyes. None of them can survive this drought independently. Together, most of them can. I was very still. That requires all of them to agree. Yes. Some of those men have been arguing over fence lines since before you were born. I know. She looked at him steadily. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's possible, and it's the right thing, and those two things don't always come together, and when they do, you don't ignore it. He was quiet for a moment. You'd have to be in the room, he said. When we talk to them. This needs someone who can... I know. I'm not saying that because you're the only one who thought of it. I know that too. She paused. I'm saying I know. I'll be in the room. He nodded. Then something shifted in his face, not to the warm expression she knew, but to something more serious, more direct. Maggie, you understand that if this works, it becomes your thing, not mine. People will know it came from you. Is that a problem? For some of them, yes. There are men in this valley who would rather lose their land than take help from a woman. She looked at him with the 40 years in her face, all of it. The kitchen and the narrow room, and the borrowed work, and the overheard cruelty, and the 13 years of sealed-off hoping, and the skillet against the wall. She looked at him with all of it. Let me worry about that, she said. The meeting was held at the Whitaker Ranch on a Wednesday, because Nate's place was the largest, and because his name on the invitation was the reason 4 of the 5 men actually came. Maggie had written the invitations. She had also written the proposal, 12 pages organized clearly with the resource calculations and the rotation schedule and the legal framework she had drafted with Gould's input after 2 evenings of work. The men arrived in the order of their pride. Calvert first, because he needed help the most and had surrendered his pride the furthest. Then Henderson, then Pruitt's older brother Amos, speaking for the family. Then a man named Garfield from the southeast quarter, who Maggie knew only by reputation, and finally last by 20 minutes in a way that was a statement Bill McCready, who was the oldest and most established of the struggling ranchers, and who had driven past Maggie twice at town events without acknowledging she existed. They sat at the long table in the main room. Nate was at the head. Davy stood to one side. Maggie sat at Nate's right hand, which was where she had decided to sit, and where she sat without asking anyone's permission or making an announcement about it. MacReady looked at her when he came in. His face said what his mouth didn't. Nate said, "Gentlemen, my wife has put together a proposal I'd like her to walk you through." A pause. The specific weighted pause of 5 men recalibrating. Calvert said, "All right." Amos Pruitt said, "Fine by me." McCready said nothing, which was its own answer. Maggie opened the proposal. She spoke for 20 minutes, and she did it the way she had learned to do everything that mattered clearly without apology, with the numbers already done. So there was nothing to argue about except the idea itself. She had anticipated every objection because she had spent 2 evenings writing them out and answering them before anyone could raise them. She knew these men. She had fed some of them. She had sat with their sick. She knew which ones were proud and which ones were practical and which ones were both. And she had written the proposal to give each of them a way to say yes that felt like their own idea. Calvert said yes in the room. Henderson said yes. Amos Pruitt said he needed a day, and she had expected that. Garfield asked 3 questions, all practical, all good. She answered them. He said yes. McCready had not spoken in 40 minutes. Everyone in the room knew it. The silence around his silence had a texture. Nate said Bill. MacReady looked at Maggie with the expression of a man who has a great deal to say and has just been put in the position of saying none of it. "This is your idea," he said to her. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "You drew up the proposal." "I did? And the resource calculations?" "Yes." Another pause. He looked at the 12 pages in front of him. He had read all of them, she could tell by the way he had marked the corners of certain pages with his thumbnail. The unconscious habit of a man who reads carefully. He had read it, and it was good, and he knew it was good, and he was deciding what to do with that information. The rotation on the south pasture, he said finally. Week 3. You've got Calvert's herd overlapping with my east section. She turned to page 9. No. Look at the dates. Calvert finishes the south section by Thursday of week 2. Your east section doesn't open until the following Monday. There's a 4-day gap. He looked at page 9. His jaw moved. You're right, he said. The room was very quiet. I'm in, he said. The room exhaled. Nate looked at Maggie with the expression she had learned by now to read precisely. It was not surprise. It was not just pride. It was the look of a man watching someone come fully into themselves, watching a thing he knew was possible, become actual, and finding that the reality was even larger than he had imagined. She looked back at him and gave him the smallest nod. Not because she needed his confirmation, because she wanted to share it. The arrangement was signed and formalized through Gould's office within the week. Harlow, when he heard about it through the territorial network, sent her a note that said simply, 3 operations, saved water corridor, stabilized regional conflict preempted. The territory owes you something it doesn't know how to say yet. She put the note in the kitchen drawer where she kept things that mattered. The drought broke in November. The rain came in over 4 days, steady and serious, the kind that meant it, and the river came back, and the stock ponds filled, and the grass began its slow recovery. The arrangement held through it, and after it, and the 5 operations that had sat across that table began the particular halting process of becoming something like neighbors instead of competitors. Emma came for Christmas. She came with her husband, a quiet, kind man named Edward, who looked at Emma the way Nate looked at Maggie, which told Maggie everything she needed to know about him, and she came with a different face than the one she'd arrived with in August. Not softer exactly, more settled. The wall was still there, but the door in it was open now, and she walked through it without making a ceremony of it, which was the only way Emma Whitaker would ever do anything. She found Maggie in the kitchen on the first morning, and she did not express surprise because she had stopped being surprised by Maggie in a kitchen. The consulting work, Emma said, pouring her own coffee. Father says you have 7 files. 9 now. Emma looked at her. Harlow gave you more. He keeps giving me more. I keep finishing them. She shrugged. I think he's running out of excuses to apologize for the pay. Emma made a sound that was a full laugh this time, not covered, not managed. A real one. Good, she said. Don't let him. I don't intend to. Emma sat at the table. She wrapped both hands around her cup the way her father did, and Maggie saw the family resemblance for the first time clear and whole. Maggie, she said. Maggie looked up. I was wrong about you. Emma said it straight the way she did everything. I came in August. I was going to find someone who wanted my father's money, or his position, or someone who needed to be taken care of. I was prepared to be very unpleasant about it. I know, Maggie said. I wasn't unpleasant enough to run you off. No, that was the first sign I was wrong. Emma looked at her coffee. The second sign was Thomas. She looked up. He told me, and Thomas never tells me anything. He told me you were the first person since Mother who made the house sound like a house. Maggie was very still. He said you don't try, Emma said. You just are. And somehow that does more than all the trying. She paused. He's right. I've watched you for 4 months now. You don't perform anything. You don't manage us. You just show up every day, and you're the same. And somewhere in that consistency, something started to... She stopped. I don't have the right word. Heal, Maggie said quietly. Emma looked at her. Yes, she said. That. Maggie set down what she was holding. She looked at this young woman who had come in August with her guard up and her grief intact and her mother's absence, like a wound she'd organized her whole life around protecting, and she felt the particular ache of something that didn't have a name, not maternal, not quite friendship, somewhere between, and its own thing entirely. Emma, she said, I am never going to be your mother. I know that. I don't want to be. Your mother was a person who made this house what it was, and you carry her, and Thomas carries her, and your father carries her, and that is right, and it will never stop being right." She held Emma's eyes. "But I am your father's wife, and I am here, and I intend to keep being here. And if there is ever anything in any part of that arrangement that is good for you, I am glad. And if you need it to stay small and careful for a while longer, that's also fine." She paused. "There's no deadline on this, Emma. Whatever this is, it can take as long as it takes." Emma's jaw tightened the way it did when she was holding something in. She looked at the window, breathed twice. "I told Edward," she said, "that I thought I might actually like you." "What did he say?" "He said he was not surprised." She looked back at Maggie. "He was right. He usually is. It's annoying." "Sounds like a good man." "He is." A pause. "Like father." "Yes," Maggie said. "Like your father." Christmas dinner was 9 people, Nate and Maggie, Emma, and Edward Thomas. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been invited, and had accepted with the precise degree of pleasure she allowed herself in most things. Earl, who had driven out from Roy's place, and who sat next to Thomas, and appeared to have decided the boy needed an old man's company, and Thomas appeared to agree. Roy and Clara, who arrived late, and flustered and good-natured. Bobby, now walking and opinionated about it, made a pass through the dining room under his own power and was retrieved by Clara before he could reach the table. Maggie stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. 9 people. The long tables with the blue-edged linens. Mrs. Aldridge at one end, with a glass of wine she was sipping with careful dignity. Earl telling Thomas something that was making Thomas's almost smile come fully to the surface. Roy looking well better than he had in years, the grazing arrangement doing what she had designed it to do. Clara laughing at something Edward said. Nate came to stand beside her in the doorway. "Too many people," he said. "No," she said. "Exactly enough." He put his hand at the small of her back. Simple quiet, the gesture of a man who knows where home is. "Come sit down," he said. She sat down. After dinner, after the dishes, after Emma and Edward had gone to bed, and Mrs. Aldridge had retired, and Roy and Clara had driven home into the cold, with Bobby asleep on Clara's shoulder. Maggie sat at the kitchen table with Thomas. It had become their place. The kitchen late, the house quiet around them, the particular understanding of 2 people who both preferred the honest hour. Earl had stayed for one more coffee, and then gone to the guest room, and it was just the 2 of them. Thomas was looking at the table. He had been quieter than usual all evening, not withdrawn, just thinking the way he sometimes was when something was working itself out inside him that wasn't ready to be words yet. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said. "All right." "About what you said. About trust." He looked up. "About watching what someone does when it costs them." "Yes, I think I've been watching you." He said it directly without apology. "Not the way my father watched you. I've been watching to see if you were going to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I kept waiting for you to slip, to show what you actually wanted, to start." He moved his hand, a gesture that meant something he couldn't quite articulate. Most people want something, even the good ones. They want gratitude, or they want to feel needed, or they want to be right. "I kept waiting to see what you wanted." She looked at him. "And I think you just want this," he said. "The house, my father, the table, whatever this is." He paused. "I think you just want it to be real." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He nodded slowly. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and said with the directness of someone who has made a decision and intends to stand by it, "I'd like to stop calling you Miss Holloway." Her heart did the thing it had been doing since August, the thing she had stopped trying to manage. "What would you like to call me?" she asked. He thought about it. A real consideration, honest and careful. "Not Mother," he said. That's not—" "I know," she said. "That's not what I'd want either. But not Miss Holloway. It's—" He made a face. "It's wrong now. It doesn't fit." "No," she said. "It doesn't. Another pause. He looked at her with those amber eyes. His mother's eyes. She had decided the color of something warm and old, and he said simply, "Maggie." One word. Her name said by this boy in this kitchen on this night. It was not a small thing. He knew it, and she knew it, and neither of them made it larger than it was, and that was exactly right. "Yes, Thomas," she said. He pushed back from the table. "Good night," he said. "Good night." She heard his boots on the back stairs. Heavy right light left. The creak of the upper hallway. The click of his door. She sat alone in the kitchen for a moment. 40 years old. Once the woman in the background. Once the woman nobody thought to ask. Once the draft horse, the kitchen fixture. The one who would die stirring someone else's pot. She thought about the skillet she had thrown at the wall of Roy's kitchen. The sound it made, the way her hands had shaken after, and the 3 women outside, whose laughter had carried her name like something disposable. She thought about a man standing in the middle of a street with his hat in his hand. She thought about a boy asking for Sunday biscuits, like it was a peace negotiation, and a daughter writing letters that got longer every week, and 9 people around a table with blue-edged linens, and a judge who told her the territory owed her something it didn't know how to say yet. She thought about what it felt like to be seen. Not the version of herself people decided on from a distance, not the convenient shape of her, but her actual and specific seen clearly and chosen on purpose. Nate appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his hands in his pockets, and his feet were bare, and his hair was the way it got when he'd run his hand through it, and he looked at her sitting at the table in the quiet. "Thomas, go up," he said. "Just now." He came and sat across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, directly, without performance, with all of his attention in it. "You all right?" he said. She looked at her husband. At the man who had stood in a street and said her name where everyone could hear, who had asked what she wanted and then gotten out of the way so she could have it. Who had built her a place at a table that was hers in every way that mattered. Who had given her not a rescue, but a recognition, and who sat across from her now barefoot in December, asking if she was all right with the simple sincerity of a man who genuinely wanted to know. "Yes," she said. "Nathaniel, I am." She meant it the way she had learned to mean things in the past 4 months, not as a performance of contentment, not as the careful answer of a woman. Managing expectations, but as a fact, plain and real, the kind that doesn't require maintenance, because it isn't built on anything false. She was 40 years old, and she had spent the first 40 learning to survive invisibility, and she was going to spend whatever came next, being visible, being chosen, being the specific person that one specific man had seen clearly enough to stand in the street and say so. That was the thing about being truly seen. Once it happened, you couldn't unsee yourself. Maggie Holloway Whitaker was done being invisible, and she was never not for a single day going back.